Wondering which heroes to choose in Hearthstone's Battlegrounds? Well, I have here the ultimate tier list based on opinions from various pros and leaderboard players.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
So for Battlegrounds at the moment, there's not a lot of raw data available. We can't just go look at win rates for various heroes, but we can look at the opinions of very high leaderboard players and the tier list they've put together for heroes, and that's exactly what I did for this video. I gathered a bunch of different tier lists, set up a very simple point system, and determined the heroes that were best on average across the best players in the world. And that's what guided these rankings, and I think it can help guide you as you make your hero selections. So I'm going to break it down pretty simply in this video. I'll also include the actual full rankings at the end of the video, but for now, let's talk about the heroes that aren't really all that good. So here we have the bottom of the barrel, the 6 worst heroes in Battlegrounds in no particular order. Spoiler alert, Pyramid is the bottom. And these are ones that you should avoid in most cases. Now, of course, all of these are still capable of winning games and top fouring, and you can do it regularly if you're skilled. And sometimes you might be offered 3 of these, and you just have to pick your poison and take one. And the final rankings at the end of the video will help you in that case. But there's one thing in common with most of these heroes, is that they have active hero powers that only impart a small stat boost to the board. They don't do things like influence your choice or your economy. And when you're spending gold on those kind of one round power spikes that are very small, just gaining a couple health, just plus 10 attacks, really not that much in the late game, for instance, a couple 3 damage pings from patches, that doesn't add up very fast, it doesn't scale very well, and that means these heroes tend to fall off or just overspend for what you're getting. So ultimately, small stats at a fairly high cost is clearly an equation that isn't working in Battlegrounds right now. So now let's move on to the sort of middle tier heroes. These are still outside the top 10, but perhaps not your best choices most of the time. Again, presented in no particular order. These have a variety of different ways to influence the game, but I think in most cases, they're either narrowly focused or a little bit risky to run. For instance, things like George. I think George's hero power can be amazing unless your opponent is, say, running Nefarian, and then all of your divine shields are wasted, and it's a very high cost, and it doesn't really pay off for those, maybe final few fights. You've got things like Mukla that's really narrowly focused because it only works specifically with beasts. So if things don't line up well for you there, then that's a problem. You've got Lich King and Ragnaros, who are kind of like our previous heroes. We have to spend a little bit for perhaps a small onboard reward, but Rag can be dominant in the mid game, and Lich King can find some really high value targets, so they stand out a little more than our previous batch of heroes. So all in all, I actually like a few of the heroes on this list fairly well. They would certainly be inside of my personal top 10, but the community has deemed these middle of the pack, and certainly fine choices, better than our previous tier. But maybe pick your favorites here if there's a play style that fits you, or just keep an eye out for the top 10 that we're going to jump into right now. So first up here at the number 10 spot, we have Shutterwalk, and he will double your next battle cry in a turn for 2 gold, which can be a nice way to spend down a little extra spare gold, particularly late in the game, to do something like double up a buff, for instance. You can make that go a really long way over the course of 4 or 5 turns, adding a lot of extra stats for only a small 2 gold investment. And although you might say, well, wait a minute, Regis, that's an active hero power that adds stats. It is, but they're much more controllable, and they're far bigger in most cases than some of the heroes we had there in the bottom, and you just have more influence over your decisions. You can use it when you want to, you don't feel compelled to, and it fits a variety of strategies. It's not walking you down a specific path. Now, one thing to keep in mind when playing Shutterwalk is you probably need some extra board space to do things like cycle battle cries, so maybe don't fill up your board too fast, or it's going to be hard to utilize his hero power and lower his impact. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Yogg Saron and Puzzle Box for his hero power, which will hire a random minion in Bob's Tavern and give it +1/+1. So basically you get a stat buff on something and you get it at a discount, which particularly in the early game can give you some nice break points when it comes to you have like 5 gold, you need to tier up and still buy something on that 3rd turn. Puzzle Box allows you to do that really nicely, and the buff, of course, can add up over time. You can just take those chances to hit what you want. Now, be careful, of course, if there's a really good minion on board. I think it's more important to buy the good minion for the full price than try to hit that discount that can backfire and give you something useless. But you'll still find a few turns in the game where you have an empty board spot, You're just trying to fit in that extra gold, and Yogg-Saron will line up rather nicely for those situations. Moving on to Bartindo Tron here. He'll reduce the cost of your tavern tiers by 1. This is another hero that can give you those really nice breakpoints where it's like math otherwise wouldn't work out, so sometimes he'll enable you to buy an extra unit while still tiering up. Beyond that, of course, you can just accelerate how quickly you're buying better units, pulling into those tier 4, tier 5 things a little bit faster than everybody else, which can do 2 things. It can help you define a game plan faster and just take really good minions out of the pool before your opponent has a chance to get them. So you can get like an advantage on beasts or get a leg up on mechs a turn sooner than your opponents and start leveraging that faster to help you, of course, win the game with the dominant strategy. Next up here we have Patchwork, who starts with 60 health instead of 40. And normally I'd be saying something like, oh, health is just a resource, it doesn't matter, go for those onboard stats instead. But here's the thing about Patchwork, right? He gives you a couple extra rounds in a given Battlegrounds game because 20 health is usually multiple attacks. And that can go a really long way because if you use it well, you can be much greedier in your decision making, you can tier up harder, you can wait for key minions, you can really dig for triples because you might have an extra round or 2 to reroll, all of which can help power spike your board in the mid to late game. And frankly, Patchwork can just stay alive long enough to often just like top 4, even if you don't have a dominant strategy. So he's a fine hero just to get those solid placings, bump your MMR a little bit, even if you're not necessarily playing for the win. So can help you win, can help you place high. All of that makes Patchwork a really reliable option, even if he's not necessarily the best at winning games. Still certainly can, and can help you place very, very well. Moving on here to the Rat King. And I'm only showing the first of his hero powers here. This is King of Beasts, that whenever you buy a beast, it'll give it +1/+2. That will cycle through all of the 4 tribes in Hearthstone or in Battlegrounds right now. So Murlocs, Demons, Mechs, and Beasts, which means occasionally on a given turn, you're going to get a really nice buff on a unit when you buy it just organically. Now, here's the thing about Rat King. That won't always hit. Sometimes his hero power just doesn't line up in a given turn. And sometimes you go down a strategy in the mid game where you're all beasts or you're all mechs. And, you know, only 1/4 of the time is this hero power perhaps relevant at all, which might seem like a major downside. And it is sometimes a downside. That's why this isn't like a top 2 hero. But nonetheless, you're still going to often hit, 3, 4, 5 buffs throughout the course of the game. And this is going to stack up over time. And the great thing about something like the Rat King compared to some of our lower tier heroes is that it's passive. You don't have to spend gold on it. So you're not sacrificing resources for something like Wagtoggle where you got to spend your gold to get some small buffs. These are small buffs that just happen for free. And that's a really nice little bonus. And sometimes you can also just play for a menagerie/amalgam style build where everything's getting buffed all the time anyway. So it works out really nicely and you can line it up quite well. So Rat King has some upside there. And certainly some downsides too, but do keep in mind for this hero that just because your buff is active, you don't have to buy like a mech just because a mech's there. If you're not playing mechs or the mech's not going to help you or it's not important to your immediate board state, don't try to fish for that value out of the hero power. Just let it go. It's okay to miss one. It's fine. Play for the strategy first. Use the hero power as a secondary bonus, not a defining style of your gameplay. Next up here, we have Nefarian and Nefarious Fate, which will deal 1 damage to all enemy minions at the start of your next combat. So a great button to hit late in the game in particular to pop off all those divine shields that are inevitably going to be there, particularly for mech style builds, which often have a lot of divine shields, but there's always just a couple amalgams rolling around that have gotten an oil modules, and Nefarious Fate's a great answer to those too, because they're usually those big crazy poisonous minions, and if they can double trade instead of single trade, that wins people games. So popping divine shields really helps you counter those game plans. It also shuts out heroes like George, for instance, who I think would be much better if Nefarian didn't exist. Now, this hero power is not going to give you a lot of value in the early to mid game, unlike, say, Ragnaros or Patches, which are much better at pinging stuff off early to mid. The 1 damage here is usually not going to matter too much in those situations. So this is a hero power I wouldn't use a lot early. I'd be saving even this for those late game battles. Now, if you have a spare gold, you've got a board frozen anyway, of course, feel free to hit the button. It's never going to hurt. Maybe never say never, but it's usually not going to hurt unless there's a security rover on your opponent's side of the board that has board space. But most of the times it won't hurt. And once you get to the late game, this can really start to power a lot, very affordably, give you some big time advantages, making Nefarian, I think, a great hero choice. Moving on here to AFK. She will skip your first 2 turns, but then you start with much higher tier minions at tier 4 and tier 3. And here's the great thing, right? Like skipping some turns doesn't really matter all that much because early game damage is almost irrelevant. You're only going to take like maybe 5 damage total usually. I think I've taken up to 7 before on those first couple turns, but that's not that big a deal because you're really going to flip things around once you get that tier 4 and tier 3 minion. Tip for this one, I would grab that tier 4 minion first. There are usually more build defining things happening there. Then you can choose your tier 3 minion to complement that tier 4 minion. If you find a big demon or big mech, then you know what to play for on that tier 3 choice as well. And you also still get to buy things on that third turn you come out as well. So you can really dump a big board of stuff usually off of those AFK turns, really start swinging. Usually AFK is very strong for those next 4 or 5 turns, dominating the mid game. So as long as you can find some kind of strategy in that point, AFK is a great hero to play because you're going to have a big meaty health total through the mid game. Even if you lost a little early, you're going to be sturdy through the mid, giving you much more time in the late game to define your strategy, find that final board build. So now into the top 3, we have the Curator, who starts the game with a 1/1 Amalgam. And right now, I think Nightmare Amalgam might be the single best unit in all of Battlegrounds. It's just so flexible. It takes every buff. It can get Divine Shield. It can get Poisonous. You'll note most people have Nightmare Amalgams in their final builds, unless maybe they're very strictly a beast build. Even then it pops in sometimes too, because it is a beast. And the Curator here gives you another Amalgam just to start with. It's a meager 1/1, but throughout the course of the game, those 1/1s can stack very, very large. And basically, anytime you can give it Poisonous with a Toxfin, it becomes a threat in a late game build. So it's something that will probably stick with you throughout the game. Not only that, but it complements any given tribal build as well. So it can be a beast, it can be a mech. I mean, probably not as much going to be a demon or murloc, but it could be, right? And that means you've got a lot of flexibility, not to mention just some extra stats in the early game, making that like turn 1 Rockpool Hunter make sense. It usually helps you win that first fight or two, which can save you a few health points, and then it just scales well from there. So strong early, it scales well. That's a great combination for a very powerful hero power. I will say one thing about this. Sometimes it might be worth it to sell your Amalgam, especially if you already have some Nightmare Amalgam action happening. This can't do things like triple up like a Nightmare Amalgam. If you're really desperate for 1 gold early in the mid game, early to mid game, and you think you could do something incredibly powerful with that 1 gold, you don't have to keep it. Usually you'll want to, but don't be scared if you think the spike's worth it. So moving on here to our number 2 hero, it is Maleficent Manastorm, and she will just give all mechs in Bob's Tavern +1/+1, which adds up really, really fast. So great in the early game, first off, because your boards are going to trade way better if you can buy some mechs in those first few turns. Those stats are great when everybody has low stat minions. +1/+1's like, 50% buff on a lot of the early like mecharoos and everything. So, or 100% buff in that case. It doubles the stats, right? So pretty crazy early game, but also this just really stacks up over time. Every time you buy a magnetic minion, that's extra stats you're going to magnetize. Every time you buy triples, it's going to triple up those stats essentially. So there's a lot of ways Tinker can scale, even though it seems like it might be early game based. It actually just starts stacking up. And by the end of the game, you might have 20 and extra stats on board thanks to Tinker, just because you keep adding it in, probably even more than that, frankly, with magnetic minions. And the other cool thing I think about Maleficent is that she really just defines your build for you. Although it's very possible to go non-mechs with Maleficent, I don't think I ever have. I think I've always gone mechs. Just because it makes it so easy. She just makes your game plan obvious. You know exactly what to buy. Also, you're going to be encouraged to buy mechs sooner, so you might buy them out before your opponents really see that line opening up. So she helps you kind of get ahead the curve a little bit. Now, I will say one thing I do for mechs, tip and strategy generally, I like to stay at tier 4 for mechs. I think that's where all the awesome mechs are at. We've got Security Rover, we've got Tron, Anoyo module, excuse me. We've got Junk Bot. So don't feel like you got to keep tiering up forever with Maleficent. Tier 4 might be your max, and you might dominate the game. I've won a lot of games staying at tier 4 with Maleficent. Tier 5 and 6 don't really have much for mechs. There's sometimes some great Foe Reaper plays, but chasing those down can be tough. So all in all, really reliable hero, super easy to play in a lot of ways, scales well, super good early, pretty much the dream as far as a hero in Battlegrounds is concerned. And then finally, our number 1 hero is Infinite Toki. I think I actually agree with this one, and perhaps I also agreed with Maleficent as well at number 2. And Temporal Tavern here will refresh Bob's Tavern for 1 gold, which is what it costs to refresh the tavern anyway. But instead of a normal refresh, Toki will make sure that the last minion will be from a higher tavern tier. So she allows you to find bigger, scarier stuff much faster and very affordably compared to your opponents, which is frankly great at every stage of the game. As long as you've got that gold to reroll, Toki's going to give you options to find a build-defining centerpiece sooner, just high-value stats, all kinds of stuff that's going to be great all the time. And in particular, what you should keep an eye out for, I think, with Toki is getting to tier 5 with Toki, and then always rolling into a tier 6 minion. This can be great for things like a beast build to find a mama bear, because there are very few tier 6 minions in the game. When you tier up to 6 and you reroll normally, you're so unlikely to actually see anything at tier 6 just because you're fighting against all those tier 5, tier 4, tier 3 minions. It's not guaranteed you'll see a 6 drop. But if you're at tier 5 and you hit the button, you're guaranteed to see a 6 drop every time you hit that button. And of course, 6 drops can be very powerful minions in a lot of builds. It's not just Mama Bear, there's other great options too. So Infinite Toki can really help you find those finishing pieces, the really high power stuff, can help you play into those really strong late game triples as well. She just allows you to play like a turn ahead of your opponents, or a couple turns ahead in some cases. And that's an incredibly powerful effect because it helps you find a path throughout a game. It helps you find the actual just raw strongest minions. It's extra value. It's basically as good as it gets. And that's why people tend to agree here that Infinite Toki is actually Battlegrounds' best hero. My breakdown here is a list of all the scores and the ranks for the heroes. This is basically my raw data set for ties. I tie broke based on the hero who had the highest score in the highest tiers, like the most tier S points, for instance, because those are clearly ones people really, really liked. There are some pretty interesting breakpoints. I think it's clear Patchwork has a pretty big gap to Bartendo Tron, for instance, so that top 7 looks particularly great if you're choosing heroes, but even Bartendo, Tron, and Yogg are gapped a little bit there over everybody else. So some real hierarchies here as far as what people are considering great. The bottom gets pretty clumped up there, just a few points difference, but you can't really go wrong with any of the top 5. It looks like they're all very, very strong options, widely considered great choices. But hopefully that helps you. You can always just use this, and pick the best one. But I will warn you, don't just choose heroes based on score. Take what feels best for you, what matches your play style. Just because somebody else says it's good doesn't mean that's the only good choice, and you might be amazing with Akazamzrak. I actually think he's hyper underrated on this list personally, so I choose him much more like he is, kind of a tier 2 option as opposed to a tier 1 choice. That said, you should do exactly the same. If you guys have any questions or thoughts on this list, if you think somebody is drastically underrated by the high-level community, tell us why. Share your thoughts. It's super early, man. You can help us rethink things and redefine how we perceive the game. That said, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, always appreciate a very nice subscription down there. We're pushing real close to 75,000, at which point we're going to announce a brand new big-time giveaway, but also 100,000's in the distance, and I want to get there, so your help is appreciated. But in the meantime, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.